I came back on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, the kind of Texas heat that lingers longer than it should, clinging to the sidewalks like it has nowhere else to go. My key didn't work. I stood there for a second, staring at the lock on the door of Unit B1 to my studio for the last 6 years, like it might correct itself if I gave it enough time. I tried again. Same result. A clean, mechanical refusal. Through the glass panel, I could see people inside. Not artists. Not anyone I recognized. Desks, laptops, a whiteboard covered in bullet points and numbers. My easel was gone. "Can I help you?" a man's voice called from inside. I didn't answer right away. I was still trying to understand what I was looking at. The walls, my walls, had been painted over. That soft off-white I'd spent a week getting just right was now a sterile gray. "I think you're in the wrong place," he added, already walking toward the door. "This is my studio," I said. He paused, hand on the handle, and gave me a look that wasn't rude, just certain. Not anymore. The words didn't land all at once. They came in pieces, like something breaking under pressure. Not anymore. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was my mother. "Don't make a scene, Elena. We handled it." I read the message twice, then a third time slower. Handled it. I didn't go inside. I didn't argue. I just stood there on the sidewalk while people walked past, like nothing unusual was happening, like a life wasn't being moved out of a building behind a locked door. Another message came in. "You can always start over somewhere else." That one settled deeper. I typed a response, deleted it, typed again, deleted that too. Instead, I called. My father picked up. "Elena," he said, like I'd just missed a family dinner. "You're back already." "Why doesn't my key work?" I asked. There was a pause. Not confusion, not concern, just a small recalculation. "We made a decision," he said finally. "For the family." "For Caleb," I said. "Don't do that," he replied, his tone sharpening just enough to remind me where the line used to be. I looked through the glass again. Someone had mounted a company logo on the far wall. I didn't recognize the name, but I knew who it belonged to. "My brother." "What did you do?" I asked. We gave him the space my mother cut, in her voice, joining the call without introduction. He needed a stable address, something presentable for investors. You weren't using it to its full potential. I let that sit between us. Inside, a woman erased something on the whiteboard and replaced it with a new number. Clean, efficient, temporary. "This wasn't yours to give," I said. "You're being emotional," my mother replied, the way she always did when she needed me to be smaller. "It's just a studio. You can paint anywhere." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was familiar. I rested my hand against the glass. On the other side, someone had moved a chair into the exact spot where my work table used to be. "I didn't argue," I said quietly. My father exhaled, like that meant we were finally being reasonable. "Good," he said. I nodded, even though they couldn't see it. "I just have one question," I added. There was a shift on the line, small but real, the kind that happens when something invisible changes shape. What my mother asked. I kept my eyes on the inside of the studio, the new paint, the choosh faces, the life that had replaced mine, like it had never been there at all. "What exactly did you give him?" I didn't go home that night. I drove instead. Not far at first. Just loops around streets I knew too well, past coffee shops where I'd spent entire afternoons sketching past the supply store that still carried the same brand of charcoal my aunt used to buy in bulk. Austin looked exactly the same. And somehow, that made it worse. Because something had changed. Or maybe it hadn't. Maybe I was just finally seeing it clearly. My studio unit B12 was never just a place I worked. It came from my Aunt Lillian, my mom's older sister, the one who never quite fit into the rest of the family, which was probably why I understood her better than anyone else did. She left it to me when she died. Not in a dramatic, lawyer-heavy way, just a clean transfer. Quiet, intentional, like she knew exactly what she was doing. "This one stays yours," she'd told me once, years before that. "Not borrowed, not shared, yours." At the time, I didn't think much of it. In my family, Things always came with strings. I just hadn't realized yet that this was the only thing that didn't. Caleb had never cared about the studio. He didn't care about anything that didn't scale. My brother was 3 years older than me, and for as long as I could remember, he had been on the verge of something. A company, a breakthrough, a version of success that always seemed just one step away, like a door he could almost reach if someone else held it open. My parents had spent most of their lives holding that door. Just one more round, my dad used to say. He just needs a little stability, my mom would add. Like stability was something you could hand over, the same way you passed a plate across the table. And me, I was the stable one, the one who didn't ask for much, the one who figured things out, the one who paid her own bills, met her deadlines, and showed up when something needed to be fixed. Not because anyone asked directly, because they didn't have to. That was the arrangement, even if no one ever said it out loud. Caleb was the future. I was the backup plan. There had been a moment, about 2 years ago, when the lines almost showed. Caleb had just come off another failed startup. Not dramatic, just quiet. The kind of failure that didn't make headlines, but still emptied accounts. He'd been staying at my parents' place, pacing their kitchen, like it was a temporary inconvenience instead of a pattern. I'd stopped by one Sunday afternoon, dropping off a mural draft I was finishing for a client downtown. They were all at the table. My dad, with his laptop open, my mom flipping through printed documents, Caleb, leaning back in his chair, like he was already somewhere else. "We've been talking," my mom said without preamble. That tone, the one that meant a decision had already been made. About what I asked. Assets, my dad said. Restructuring things. Making sure we're positioned correctly for Caleb's next move. I remember standing there, still holding my sketch tube, feeling like I'd walked into the middle of something that had started long before I arrived. Caleb didn't look at me. He never did not when things mattered. "There are properties we could leverage," my mom continued. "Spaces that aren't being used to their full potential." I knew what she meant before she said it. My studio had just landed its first real contract with a local gallery. I'd been working late every night, building something that finally felt like it belonged to me. "It's not available," I said. Not defensive, just clear. My mom smiled. "Not warm. Controlled." "Of course it is," she said. "Everything is, if it helps the family." I remember my dad shifting in his chair, not disagreeing, just not quite meeting my eyes. And Caleb, he finally looked at me then. Not with guilt, not even expectation. Just calculation, like he was trying to decide if I was going to be a problem. I didn't argue that day. I said I had a deadline and left, and somehow that was enough. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it just delayed something that was always going to happen anyway. Back in my car, parked across the street from my old building, I watched the lights inside Unit B12 flicker on one by one as evening settled in. People moved through the space like it had always been theirs, like I had never been part of it. My phone sat in my lap, silent now. No more messages, no explanations, just a decision that had already been made, carried out, and installed into my life without asking if I still lived there. I thought about what my mom had said earlier. You can always start over somewhere else. She believed that, because for her, starting over had never meant losing anything that couldn't be replaced. For me, it wasn't just a space. It was the only things in my life that had ever been given to me without conditions. And they had handed it over like it was temporary, like I was. I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes for a second, letting the memory of that Sunday settle into place beside everything I'd seen today. Not new, just clearer. When I opened them again, I looked at the building one more time. At the windows, at the light, at the life continuing without me. And for the first time, the question didn't feel emotional. It felt precise. What exactly had they decided was theirs to give? Wednesday morning came with a kind of clarity I didn't ask for. The sky was too bright, the air too still, like the city had decided everything was normal, and I was the only one out of place. I didn't go back to the studio right away. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and my phone beside it, scrolling through emails I hadn't paid attention to before. Not because they weren't there, but because I'd never had a reason to look at them this closely. Subject lines that used to feel routine now felt loaded. Property update. Administrative notice. Assignment confirmation. I clicked the last one. The email was from a title services company I didn't recognize. Dated 5 days ago, while I was still out of town. The language was formal, clean, and just vague enough to slip past someone who wasn't expecting to be part of a transaction. Attached was a document, assignment of use agreement. I stared at the title for a moment before opening it. The first page didn't look alarming. Standard formatting, legal phrasing, names I recognized. My parents listed as facilitators. Caleb listed as the receiving party. And then I saw it. My name, Elena Brooks, appearing in clean typed letters under a section labeled Grantor. My chest tightened, not sharply, but slowly, like something pulling inward. I scrolled down. There was a signature line, and there it was, my signature, or something that looked enough like it to pass if you weren't paying attention. The loop in the E slightly off, the tail of the last name too short, small differences, easy to miss, not mine. I leaned back in my chair, the document still open on my screen. The language of the agreement didn't say sale. It didn't say transfer of ownership. It said assignment of use, temporary, functional, harmless if you didn't think about it too hard. It allowed the receiving party, Caleb's company, to use Unit B12 as a registered business address, to operate within the space as needed for administrative and operational purposes, to represent the location as an active place of business. I read that line twice. Active place of business. I pictured the whiteboard, the desks, the logo on the wall. They hadn't just moved in. They had built something inside it. I scrolled further. There were additional clauses. Dense, technical, easy to skim past. Language about compliance, about permitted use, about responsibility for maintaining the conditions of the space under local guidelines. I didn't fully understand it. Not yet, but I understood enough to know this wasn't just a casual decision. It had been structured, packaged, processed. My phone buzzed again. A new message from Caleb. You saw it yet? I didn't answer. A few seconds later, another one. It's just paperwork, Elena. Don't overthink it. I let out a slow breath and closed the document, then opened it again like it might look different the second time. It didn't. My name was still there. My signature, almost mine, still sitting at the bottom like a quiet approval I had never given. I thought about Sunday, 2 years ago. About the way my mom had said everything was available if it helped the family. Back then, it had sounded like pressure. Now it looked like a process. I clicked back to the email thread. There were replies, short ones, efficient, from my dad, from a coordinator, from someone in Caleb's company, everyone moving things forward, no one asking me. I scrolled to the timestamp, signed and processed 2 days before I came home, before I stood on the sidewalk and tried my key, before I saw the paint, the desks, the life that had already replaced mine. I closed my laptop this time and didn't open it again. The room felt smaller than it had the night before. Not because anything had changed, because something had been confirmed. I wasn't dealing with the misunderstanding. This had been planned, documented, executed, and whatever they had given Caleb, it had my name on it, even if I had never agreed to it. By Thursday afternoon, I went back. Not because I was ready, because not going felt worse. The sun had shifted, throwing a harsher light across the building, catching every imperfection I used to ignore. The cracked concrete near the entrance, the uneven line where the old paint met the brick. Things I had lived with, things I had made mine. The door was unlocked this time. No hesitation, no resistance. That felt wrong too. Inside, the air was colder. Not physically, but in that way spaces feel when they stop belonging to the person who built them. The smell hit first. Not paint, not charcoal, not the faint trace of turpentine that used to live in the corners of the room no matter how often I cleaned. It smelled like office supplies, plastic, coffee that had gone cold in paper cups, temporary things. My footsteps sounded louder than I expected as I moved further in, like the room didn't recognize me anymore. The walls were gone, not literally, but everything that had made them mine had been erased. The layered sketches I used as underpainting. The pencil marks I never fully covered. The texture that came from years of working over the same surfaces again and again. All of it flattened under a uniform coat of gray. There was a long table in the center, now clean and rectangular, lined with identical chairs. My old work table, the one with the paint stains that no amount of sanding could remove, was gone. I looked to the back corner, the spot where I used to keep my storage racks. Empty, or not empty, replaced. Stacks of cardboard boxes, labeled with black marker. Office files, supplies, equipment, no names, no history. "You shouldn't be in here without checking in," a voice said behind me. I turned. A woman stood near the doorway, holding a tablet against her chest. Late 30s, maybe, early 40s. Professional in that way that didn't need to be announced. "I used to be," I said. She studied me for a moment, then softened just slightly. Not sympathy, recognition of inconvenience. "Things are still being set up," she said. "We're trying to keep it organized." "We? How long has this been in progress?" I asked. "About a week," she replied. "We had a tight timeline." A week. I did the math without meaning to. They had started before I came home, before I had any chance to see it, before I could even ask a question. "What happened to the contents?" I asked. She tapped her tablet, scrolling. Everything that was here was cataloged and moved to off-site storage. Climate controlled. You can request access through the company. The company, not me. "Do you have the address?" I asked. She hesitated just for a second, then nodded. "I can send it to you." "Please." She typed something in, then looked back up. "You're Elena, right?" "ITD." "Dici. Stem. Aistomim. Yamam. "Yes, they said you might come by," she added. There were notes. Notes. I glanced at the table, at the neat rows of chairs at the whiteboard, now filled with schedules and projections. This wasn't temporary. It just looked like it. "Is he here?" I asked. "Caleb," she said. "No, he's been in and out, mostly calls." "Of course." I nodded and stepped further into the space, slower now. Near the far wall, there was a section they hadn't finished yet. A patch where the gray paint stopped halfway, leaving a strip of the original surface exposed. My surface. Faint lines, still visible underneath. Charcoal marks. A half-erased outline from a piece I had never finished. Something unfinished, still breathing. Under everything they had layered on top. I reached out, stopping just short of touching it. "They'll cover that today," the woman said, following my gaze. "It's not part of the new design." Of course it wasn't. Nothing about this place was. My phone buzzed again in my pocket. I didn't check it. I didn't need to. I already knew who it was. I looked around one more time. At the chairs, the boxes, the clean lines that had replaced everything irregular and human. They hadn't just taken the space. They had rewritten it. And whatever they thought they were building here, it was already resting on something they hadn't bothered to understand. I turned toward the door, the address for the storage unit already sitting in my inbox. Behind me, I could hear the woman moving again, the quiet efficiency of someone continuing a process that had already been approved. Outside, the heat felt different, sharper, more real. I stood there for a moment, the image of that unfinished section of wall still clear in my mind. Not erased, just temporarily covered. And for the first time since I came back, something inside the pressure shifted. Not relief, not yet, just a clearer sense that this wasn't finished. Not even close. Friday morning, I met Marcus Reeve at a coffee shop off South Congress that still had mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu no one under 60 could read without leaning in. Marcus and I had known each other long enough to skip the performance of small talk. He wasn't a close friend, not in the way people use that word when they mean emotional intimacy. He was someone I trusted to care more about facts than comfort, which at that point felt more useful. He'd spent 15 years in commercial real estate, most of it dealing with redevelopment projects, zoning, headaches, and the kind of paperwork people signed too fast because they wanted a deal to feel simple. I slid my laptop across the table. He read in silence. That was the first thing I appreciated about him. He never filled a room with noise, just because he had access to words. The espresso machine hissed behind us. A couple near the window argued softly about grandkids and school pickup. Outside, the street looked normal, in that infuriating way the world does when your own life has tipped sideways. Marcus reached the second page of the agreement and stopped. "Did you authorize any of this?" he asked. "Number." He nodded once, not because he believed me emotionally, but because the document itself had already started making that case. He scrolled further, then further still. "Okay," he said at last. "This is sloppier than I expected." I sat up straighter. "Sloppy how?" He turned the screen slightly so I could see the section he was pointing to. Dense legal language. Municipal references, a clause I'd skimmed, because it looked like boilerplate. "It says the space is being assigned for operational use," he said. "But this unit isn't ordinary commercial inventory." I looked at him, meaning. Marcus leaned back, folded his arms, and studied me for a second, like he was deciding how much to explain before I asked the right question. "Your aunt's unit was part of an old arts preservation overlay," he said. "I remember the building. City granted special use protections years ago to keep developers from wiping out all the artist spaces when the neighborhood started getting expensive." Something in me went very still. "I didn't know that." "You wouldn't have needed to," he said. "It would have been buried in the original property. File, zoning records, maybe OA disclosures, if anyone bothered to read them. The point is that space can't just be converted into general office use because somebody decides it's more profitable." I stared at him. "Not office use, not legally." Marcus tapped the clause again. "If Caleb's company is operating out of there the way this agreement describes, they may be in violation already, or headed there fast." The coffee shop noise blurred at the edges. I thought about the whiteboard, the desks, the logo bolted to my wall like permanence. I thought about the woman with the tablet, saying they had a tight timeline, like urgency itself made things valid. "So this isn't just about them taking the studio," I said slowly. "No," Marcus replied. "It's about them using the studio in a way the unit may not even allow." He didn't dramatize it. That made it worse. "What happens if that gets flagged?" I asked. He gave me the kind of look professionals give when they don't want to overstate something, but also don't want to lie. "Depends on enforcement," he said. "Fines, orders to cease operations, problems with investors if they're representing the address as compliant business space. And if your name is attached to the assignment." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. I looked down at my own signature on the screen, almost mine, close enough to pass through a system built on speed and assumption. For the first time since Tuesday, the shape of what they'd done stopped feeling vague. They hadn't just taken the one thing in my life that had been mine without conditions. They had tied me to the risk. They had used my name to make their shortcut look legitimate. Marcus closed the laptop gently, like he was done pretending this was a misunderstanding. "If I were you," he said, "I'd stop thinking of this as a family argument." I nodded, but I didn't say anything right away, because something had already shifted before he finished the sentence. Not anger, not revenge, just the clean, hard recognition that silence would help them more than it would protect me. And I was done confusing those two things. By the time I walked back to my car, the morning had burned off into full heat. My phone buzzed once in my bag. Then again, I didn't need to look. For the first time, not answering didn't feel passive. It felt like choosing a side, my own. I didn't call them that afternoon. Not my mother, not my father, not Caleb. By the time I got home, the quiet in my apartment felt different than it had the night before. Less like shock, more like space. Useful space. I set my bag down, pulled the laptop back out, and opened the agreement again, not to understand it emotionally this time, but to look at it the way Marcus had, line by line, what it said, what it didn't say, where my name appeared, where it didn't. By the second pass, the pattern started to form. They had moved fast. Fast enough to rely on assumption. Fast enough to assume no one would slow down long enough to question the structure. Fast enough to use my name as a bridge. My phone lit up again. Mom, then Dad, then Caleb. 3 separate calls. No voicemail. I let them ring. A minute later, a text from my mother. We need to fix this before you make it worse. I stared at that for a moment. Not before this gets worse. Before you make it worse. The shift wasn't subtle. They didn't think they had done something wrong. They thought I was about to become the problem. Another message came in this time. Time from Caleb. Investors are asking questions. What did you say? I hadn't said anything. Not yet. I closed my eyes for a second, leaning back in the chair. That word stayed with me. Investors. Not family. Not apology. Not explanation. Investors. Whatever they had built inside my studio, it wasn't stable. Not the way they were presenting it. And they knew it. I picked up the phone, scrolled once, and then did something I hadn't done since Tuesday. I called someone else. Jordan Hayes. The voice on the other end answered, calm and direct. Hi, I said. My name is Elena Brooks. Marcus Reeves suggested I call you. There was a brief pause. Not hesitation, just recalibration. Okay, she said. Tell me what's going on. I didn't rush it. I walked her through it, the way it had actually happened. The studio, the agreement, the signature, the conversion, the zoning restriction Marcus had pointed out. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, there was a beat of silence that didn't feel empty. It felt measured. Do you have the documents? She asked. Yes. Send them over, she said. Everything. Emails, attachments, timestamps. I did. While she reviewed, I stood at the window, looking out at the parking lot below, watching a couple argue over something small that would probably feel bigger later. 5 minutes passed, then 10. When she came back on the line, her tone hadn't changed, but something underneath it had sharpened. You're still listed as the assigning party, she said. Yes, and you didn't sign this. Number. Then, you have exposure, she said plainly. Not just in terms of ownership, but liability. If that space is being used in violation of its permitted use, and your name is attached, you're part of that chain, whether you intended to be or not. I felt that settle in, not as panic, as structure. They used my name to get around something I said. That's what it looks like, Jordan replied. Or at least, they used your name to make it look cleaner than it is. Cleaner, legitimate, safe. Things that made other people stop asking questions. What are my options? I asked. She didn't answer immediately. First, she said, you stop treating this like an internal disagreement. You don't communicate with them about the substance of this without representation. No informal fixes. No verbal agreements. I thought about my mother's message. Fix this. We document everything, Jordan continued. We assess whether the assignment is valid, whether the signature is contestable, and whether the current use of the space violates local restrictions. Her voice stayed even, controlled. And then I asked, then we decide how visible you want this to become. Visible. The word landed differently than anything else had. Not private, not contained, visible. My phone buzzed again on the table behind me. Caleb. I turned slightly, looking at the screen without picking it up. For the first time, I didn't feel pulled toward it. I felt distance. I'll take the case, Jordan said. But you need to be clear about something, Elena. I waited. This doesn't stay quiet if we move forward. I nodded even though she couldn't see it. I know, I said. And for the first time, since I had stood outside that locked door on Tuesday, I meant it. Because this wasn't about getting my studio back the way it had been. That version was already gone. This was about deciding whether I was still willing to be part of a system that erased me and called it family. I'm ready, I said. There was no relief when I hung up. No sense of resolution. Just a clean line drawn where there hadn't been one before. On one side, silence. On the other, consequence. I picked up my phone, turned it face down, and let it keep vibrating against the table. Not ignored, just no longer in control. Monday morning didn't start with a phone call. It started with an email. Not to me, to Caleb. I knew before I opened my laptop, because my phone had already lit up 3 times in under a minute. His name, my mother's, then my father's. All missed. I sat down, anyway, slower than I needed to be, and opened my inbox. Jordan had forwarded it. Subject line, Notice of Compliance Review. Unit B12, no emotion, no accusation, just structure. I read it, once then again, not because I didn't understand it, but because I understood it too clearly. The city had initiated a formal compliance review regarding the use of Unit B12 under its registered designation. The notice referenced potential violation of use restrictions tied to the Creative Preservation Program. Operational activity at the address was not being fully shut down, but it was being questioned, flagged, recorded. Any continued representation of the space as an active business location would now exist under scrutiny. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence settle. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of consequences. My phone rang again. This time I answered. "Elena," my mother said immediately, her voice tight in a way I hadn't heard before. Not angry, controlled panic. "What did you do?" I didn't answer the question. "What did you think would happen?" I asked instead. A pause. Not long, but long enough. "You've taken this too far," she said softer now. Like reason might work where control hadn't. "This is affecting Caleb's business. There are people involved. There are always people involved." "Then maybe they should have been part of the decision," I said. My father came onto the line without announcement. "This doesn't need to become public," he said. "We can handle this internally." Internally. That word had been doing a lot of work for them. "It already is public," I replied. "You just didn't think it would be." Another pause. This one heavier. "You're hurting your brother," my mother said. "No," I said. "I'm stepping out of something you put me into." Silence again. Not empty this time. Fractured. I ended the call before they could reshape it. My phone didn't stop after that. Caleb called next, then texted, then called again. Finally, I answered. "What did you tell them?" He demanded, skipping anything that resembled a greeting. "The truth," I said. "That's not helpful," he snapped. "Investors are asking questions now. They're flagging the address. Do you understand what that does to around?" Yes, I did. "That's not my responsibility," I said. "It is when your name is on the paperwork," he shot back. There it was. Not denial. Not anymore. Recognition. "You put it there," I said. "I used what we had," he replied quickly. "That's how this works. You leverage assets." Assets. I let that word sit between us. "And I'm not one," I said. He exhaled sharply, frustration cracking through. "You're blowing this up over a space." I thought about the fuel, the charcoal lines, the light that still moved through it, whether anyone understood it or not. "No," I said. "You built something unstable and called it solid." That was when his voice shifted. Not louder, sharper. "What do you want?" he asked. It wasn't a question. It was a calculation. I didn't answer right away, because for the first time, I understood something I hadn't fully let myself see before. There was no version of this where we all walked away intact. Not anymore. "I want my name out of it," I said finally. "That's not how this works," he said. I almost smiled. "It is now." I hung up. The rest of the day moved differently. Slower on the surface, faster underneath. By mid-afternoon, Caleb's company had removed Unit B12 from one of their listings, but not all. The website still showed it. A pitch deck circulating online still referenced it. Too late. Once something is flagged, it doesn't disappear when you delete it. It stays. Tracked. Referenced. Connected. That evening, I drove past the building without stopping. The lights were still on inside, but fewer of them. Movement, but not momentum. For the first time since I came back, I wasn't trying to get inside. I was watching from the outside, and the difference was clear. They were still inside the situation. I wasn't. Not anymore. By Tuesday afternoon, I understood exactly how I'd misjudged them. I had thought pressure would make them slow down. Instead, it had made them cleaner. Jordan called me from her office just after lunch, her voice level in the way it always was when the news wasn't good enough to soften. "The city didn't shut them down," she said. "Not yet. They issued a compliance inquiry and a temporary review notice. That matters, but it's not the same as a stop order." I stood at my kitchen counter with one hand braced against the edge, looking out at the parking lot, like there might be something useful in all that sun-bleached concrete. So they keep operating, for the moment, in a limited way, she said. And Caleb's counsel is already framing this as a family dispute dressed up as a zoning complaint. That landed exactly where it was meant to. Family dispute. Emotional. Personal. Containable. I closed my eyes for a second. That's the mistake, isn't it? Jordan didn't answer right away. We led with the violation, she said finally. They're responding with optics. We need something older than their paperwork. Something that existed before Caleb, before the assignment, before any of them could pretend this was just about hurt feelings. After we hung up, I sat for a long time without moving. Not because I was defeated, because I could feel the shape of the problem changing, and I didn't want to rush past it. They were counting on familiar roles. My mother certain enough to reduce everything to tone. My father quiet enough to let bad decisions look reasonable. Caleb moving fast and calling it vision. And me, the daughter who would react, explain, and eventually get tired. That was the version of me their strategy still depended on. By 4 o'clock, I was standing inside the storage unit they'd moved my life into. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Canvas bins, labeled crates. My old drafting stool shoved beside a banker's box of cables and printer paper that clearly wasn't mine. The whole place looked like memory, packed by someone who didn't believe objects had weight beyond square footage. I started opening boxes, more carefully this time, not looking for comfort, looking for record. At the back of one crate, under a stack of rolled studies, in an old drop cloth stiff with paint, I found a flat archival case I hadn't seen in years. Dark green, brass corners, my Aunt Lillian's initials pressed into the handle. I set it on the floor and opened it. Inside were papers, all of them sleeved and dated, in the meticulous way she did everything that mattered. Old city correspondence, property files, tax notices, and beneath those, a thin cream folder stamped with the seal of the Austin Cultural Preservation Office. My pulse changed. Not faster, sharper. I sat cross-legged on the concrete and read. The unit had been preserved under a live work creative designation attached to a neighborhood arts retention grant my aunt had joined decades earlier. The language was clear in a way modern paperwork rarely was. The space wasn't just protected by zoning. It had been represented to the city as a working artists unit meant to remain in creative use with occupancy disclosures and annual filings tied to that purpose. It predated all of them, all of this, and there clipped to the back was a signed acknowledgement from my aunt transferring stewardship materials to me after her diagnosis. Not sentimental, operational, a paper trail. I took photos, then called Jordan. She was quiet for longer this time. When she finally spoke, I could hear the shift. This is what we needed, she said. Not because it's emotional, because it's administrative, historical, and specific. They didn't just take your space. They put a protected unit into false use under your name. I leaned back against the metal wall of the storage unit and looked at the case in my lap. For the first time in days, the fear stopped moving around and took a shape I could face. My phone lit up again. Mom, then Caleb, then Dad. I let all three go unanswered. A minute later, Caleb texted, "You're dragging this out because you like watching people panic." I read it once and set the phone down. That was wrong too. I didn't want panic. I wanted accuracy. I wanted the truth moved out of the family version of events and into a system that kept records. By the time I locked the unit and carried the green case back to my car, the evening heat had softened. Not gone, just more bearable. The same was true of me. I hadn't gotten my studio back. There was no victory in sight yet, but the chaos had narrowed into something cleaner. They had built their story on speed. I was about to answer it with history. By Thursday morning, the story they had built started breaking in places they couldn't tape over. Jordan met me outside a low municipal building downtown, the kind with bad parking, tired planters, and fluorescent-lit hallways that make everything feel less dramatic than it is. That was part of why I liked her. Systems didn't care about family mythology. They cared about records. She had filed the preservation documents, the occupancy history, the archived correspondence from my aunt, and a formal challenge to the validity of the assignment under my name. Not theatrical, not loud, just enough to force the right people to look at the right paper in the right order. That morning they did. We weren't there for a hearing, not exactly. More like a review conference. No one in my family had expected to matter until it did. Caleb arrived first, wearing the same navy blazer he always used when he wanted to look like a man with options. My father came beside him, jaw tight, trying on dignity like it still fit. My mother walked in a step behind them, composed in the way she always was, when she believed control was mostly posture. Then she saw me, not alone, not flustered, not asking. Something in her face changed so quickly, it might have passed for annoyance if you didn't know her. Caleb's attorney was already there, a man in his 50s with a leather portfolio and the kind of expression that suggested he'd build for optimism before breakfast. He nodded at Jordan, then at me, in the professional way people do when they're about to stop pretending something is informal. Inside the conference room was colder than it needed to be. A city compliance officer sat at the head of the table with a preservation review analyst beside her and a zoning administrator dialing in remotely. No one looked interested in our feelings. Good. Jordan did the talking first. She laid out the timeline cleanly. The live work creative designation, the historical filings, the preservation grant conditions, the transfer of stewardship materials from my aunt to me, the assignment agreement bearing my name, and a signature I had not provided. Then she slid over the photos from inside the studio. The desks, the branding, the operational setup. The compliance officer looked through them without changing expression. That bothered Caleb more than anger would have. Anger can be argued with, procedure can't. His attorney tried first. He framed the conversion as temporary, administrative, a misunderstanding between family members over access and intended use. He used phrases like good faith reliance and informal permission, an inherited ambiguity. I watched the preservation analyst open the archival file. Then I watched her stop. She turned one page toward the officer and tapped a section in the middle. This unit was retained under continuous, creative use representation, she said. The city's reliance here wasn't generic zoning. It was programmatic. This address was preserved specifically to prevent commercial conversion of exactly this kind. The room changed, not emotionally, structurally. Caleb leaned forward. It's still a working space, he said. We're building something there. The analyst didn't even look at him. Not under this designation, you're not. His attorney shifted gears fast, moving to the assignment. Maybe too fast. There had been documentation, he said. Family authority, practical necessity. My parents had long managed related matters. He was still speaking when the compliance officer lifted the agreement and asked the only question that mattered. Did Ms. Brooks sign this herself? No one answered quickly enough. My father looked down. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. And Caleb, who had spent his whole life moving as if speed alone could make reality keep up, made the mistake of speaking into silence. She knew what we were doing, he said. Jordan didn't raise her voice. That is not what was asked. The officer set the paper down. Effective immediately, she said. The use of Unit B12, as represented business space, is under suspension, pending formal review. Any continued operational representation at that address will be treated as non-compliance. If the signature is contested, this assignment may be referred for separate examination. Caleb went still, in the way people do right before panic shows up in public. His attorney started talking again, but faster now. My mother tried to interrupt, with tone, with context, with the familiar family trick of making process sound cruel. It didn't work here. Every sentence she offered seemed to make her smaller. Then Jordan handed over one more item: investor materials, pulled from Caleb's own business deck, the address listed as established headquarters. That was the point where the collapse became visible, not because anyone shouted, because no one needed to. The zoning administrator on speaker asked whether those representations had been used in financing discussions. Caleb didn't answer. His attorney did, and not cleanly. The compliance officer made a note. My phone buzzed in my bag. Once, then again, then again. I didn't need to check. I knew up what happened next before anyone said it out loud. Calls, emails, clarifications, investors who suddenly preferred distance. A startup that had been pitched as stable, now tied to false use, disputed authorization, and an address it could not legally stand on. Outside the building, my mother caught my arm. Not hard, just enough to repeat an old pattern. "You're humiliating your brother," she said. I looked at her hand until she let go. "No," I said. "The records are." For the first time, she had nothing ready. Not because she understood, because the story had moved somewhere she couldn't manage with volume. Caleb came out a minute later, already on the phone, already speaking in that thin, controlled voice people use when everything expensive starts slipping at once. I watched him pace toward the curb, the navy blazer, the investor language, the practiced certainty, all of it still there, but no longer holding. That was the difference. Nothing had exploded. It had simply stopped working, and somehow that was worse for him. By the time I got back to my car, I didn't feel peace. I felt impact, the kind that arrives after the collision, when everything is still upright for 1 second too long before gravity remembers its job. The review wasn't the end, but it was the moment. Their version of the truth stopped carrying weight, and mine started making a record. By the following Monday, the decision came through in writing. Not dramatic, not loud, just a formal notice, stamped and dated, confirming what had already begun to unfold in that room downtown. The assignment of use, tied to my name, was under formal dispute. The representation of Unit B12 as an active business address was no longer permitted under its designation. Any continued operation under that claim would trigger enforcement. Clear, final enough to matter. Jordan forwarded the document with a short note. This closes the loop on their position. The rest is process. Process. That word felt different now. It didn't feel like delay. It felt like structure holding. I didn't call my parents. They didn't call me either. The silence between us had changed shape. It wasn't avoidance anymore. It was distance, clean, intentional, and finally, not mine to fix. Caleb's company removed the address from their site within 48 hours. The logo came down from the wall inside the studio not long after. The desks disappeared. The whiteboard was wiped clean. Not out of respect, out of necessity. By midweek, I stood in front of Unit B12 again. The key worked this time. The door opened with the same quiet click it always had, like nothing had happened. Inside, the space was stripped back to something unfamiliar. The gray paint remained in most places, but the office traces were gone. No chairs, no cables, no hum of activity trying to prove itself. Just the room. And the light. It still came in the same way, cutting across the floor in a long, steady line that shifted with the hour. My aunt used to chase that light with her canvases, moving them inch by inch as the day changed. I stepped inside slowly, not claiming, not reclaiming, just entering. The unfinished section of wall I had seen days before was still there, half covered, the charcoal lines beneath faint but visible if you knew where to look. I walked over to it, and this time, I let my hand rest against the surface. It felt the same, not untouched, but not gone. Behind me, the room stayed quiet. No phones, no voices, no one telling me what this space should be used for. For the first time since Tuesday, I understood something clearly, without needing to explain it out loud. They hadn't taken my studio. They had tried to redefine it, and they had failed. Not because I fought harder, because what it was had been built long before they decided to use it. I set my bag down near the wall and pulled out a small piece of charcoal from one of the boxes I'd brought back from storage. It wasn't new. It didn't need to be. I looked at the blank section of drywall beside the old marks. Then I drew a single line. Slow, deliberate, certain, no audience, no announcement, just the beginning of something that didn't require permission. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere down the street, a door slammed. Life continued the way it always did, unaware, uninterested, steady. Inside, I stayed where I was, not thinking about what had been taken, not thinking about what had been proven, just standing in a space that was still mine, without needing anyone else to agree with that. The version of me that would have explained, negotiated, or softened this moment didn't feel missing. It felt finished, and in its place, something quieter had settled. Not victory, not forgiveness, something steadier than both. I picked up the charcoal again and continued the line. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself, I'd be curious which one you chose and why. If this story stayed with you, you can share your thoughts below or follow along for the next one.